If I had a nickel for every time an ice-based character was considered one of the best during their launch of the game, only for them to be considered one of the worst ones, I would have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right? Well, at least Yanqing's getting that new boss-themed endgame, right? Hi everyone, welcome to a new Genshin concept series called Trailblazer 2 Traveler. Here, we will be taking characters from Honkai Star Rail and translating their kits into a Genshin setting. I had this idea after watching a Vars video on Yanqing. Roll the clip, please.
Ironically, Yanqing would be an extremely powerful character if this was Genshin, where you can avoid enemy attacks either by dodging out of the way or abusing iframes on elemental burst animations.
To be fair, this isn't exactly a new concept. I mean, a lot of people have said that certain unused characters in Star Rail could perform better in Genshin, and vice versa. That right there was just the clip that jump-started the idea. To start off the series, we'll look at Yanqing's kit and how he might play out in the world of Teyvat. Just to quickly go over any disclaimers, just like everyone else, I am prone to making mistakes in my concepts or calculations. All of my concept videos have the goal of opening up discussions for others to share their ideas and thoughts. Feel free to comment down below, but just remain respectful to everyone. For this series, I want to make it very clear on 2 things. 1, balancing is not a major focus in this series. I'll try my best to add quality of life buffs for the sake of comfort, but since I won't be adjusting the multipliers, there's a chance that some characters will still end up underwhelming. This series is mainly supposed to explore any build or team options an HSR unit would have in Genshin. Second thing, I am actually not a religious HSR player. In terms of gacha games, Genshin's the only one that I can consistently play. But with that being said, I feel like for this series to be successful, I only need to understand Genshin's mechanics on an advanced level, and then Star Rail can be more basic understandings. There's an entire process to what I've done to make this idea work, mainly converting numbers between games. Rather than spend another 10 minutes explaining it here, I decided to put all of that in a separate video. If you want or need me to go over my whole design rules and process, then there's a video linked in the description down below, or in that little corner pop-up that may or may not show up around now. For the most part, you don't need to watch that to understand the concept shown here, but for things like numbers and calculations, that video just shows that I'm not pulling random numbers out of my ass. I'll be showing calculations in this series, so a quick rundown on that. Characters and weapons are level 90, talents are 8, artifacts are maxed out. Constellations, enemy defense and resistance, and any external buffs are not included unless I say so. And if they are included, assume enemy level is 100 for defense and base resistance is 10%. And to finish things off, links to social media and music are all down below as well. With all of this out of the way, we can now begin. To start off Yanqing's redesign, we need to cover his overall profile. First, I want to start off by establishing how we should be basing our judgments. Since he's a standard unit in Star Rail, we should be viewing him as such for this video. While I will still be trying to make him good at C0, this does make Constellations a bit more relevant later on. For his weapon and element, Yanqing will be a cryo sword user. For his gameplay archetype, we'll actually do a quick little game to find out. Will Yanqing's kit revolve around being a freeze DPS, a melt DPS, a physical DPS, or a mono cryo DPS? If you said physical DPS, you are correct. Either you guessed right, or you watch my content enough and know that I have a love for that simple white number. But additionally, all of you Yanqing mains know this, but his kit is chock full of crit stats. This actually makes Blizzard Strayer somewhat anti-synergistic since using it on him would overcap the crit rate. We currently don't have any character who would create benefits from overcapping. Please be Saritsa, please be Saritsa, please be Saritsa. So I stayed away from making him a freeze unit. He could have been a melt or mono cryo unit, but we have 7 other characters in the ice category. One of them could easily cover that archetype. His base stats in Star Rail are 893 HP, 679 attack, and 412 defense. Following my base stat conversions, the new stats are going to be 9377 HP, 306 attack, and 597 defense. This puts him on the higher end of attack stats, between Shenhe at 303 and Klian Risley at 310, but on the lower end of HP and defense, making him a very squishy DPS unit. Onto his Ascension stat. While many 5-star DPS units gain a crit Ascension stat, I opted to give him damage percent instead, once again due to its already insane crit bonuses. It'll be a 36% physical damage bonus. No 5-star Genshin unit has a physical damage bonus, but Razor as a 4-star does. His bonus is 30%, and we actually have a working formula to calculate that as a 5-star value, which is a simple 6:5 ratio. 30 times 6 divided by 5 is 36. Now that we covered his stats, let's look at his kit. Star Rail doesn't have full attack animations, so what I'll likely do is choose or randomly select a character and adopt their multipliers and animations. I decided that Xingqiu would be the person we use since their combat techniques are very similar. After all, both of them are swordspeople who both summon blades to do their dirty work. Nothing super special with this section, but I figured it's important to discuss since Yanqing's a physical DPS. That means his auto attacks will be dealing a bit more damage than the average unit. Yanqing's skill is based on his Star Rail skill and talent. At level 8, he will strike an enemy with a barrage of icy blades, dealing cryo damage based on 193% of his attack, and gaining the Soul Steel Sync effect. While having this effect, Yanqing's crit rate and crit damage will be increased by 18.8% and 26% respectively. When Yanqing hits an opponent, he will deal a coordinated attack, summoning a Snow Shard, which deals a hit of physical damage equal to 88% of his attack. If Yanqing is off-field, other party members' attacks can trigger Snow Shard, but each hit will only have a 58% chance to trigger. If Yanqing takes damage, the Soul Steel Sync effect will disappear. Snow Shard can only be triggered once every 0.3 seconds. This lasts for 12 seconds, but only with a 6-second cooldown. Here are the main changes I made with this ability. 1. Yanqing's original follow-up attacks have a base chance to freeze the enemy, and that enemy takes additional damage at the start of their turn. What I did was remove the freezing effect altogether, and I added that 44% damage multiplier to Yanqing's coordinated attack. Second, I adjusted the duration and the cooldowns to be much more forgiving in a Genshin setting. True to the nature of his Star Rail version, he's going to be reliant on shielders, and this is a fact I intentionally tried to maintain. Of course, I didn't want to make it extremely punishing for players. Just like Albedo's skill, Yanqing has a long duration but a shorter cooldown. If he's unfortunate enough to get damaged, the downtime shouldn't be too long. He can easily cast his skill and get his attacks back. Third, Yanqing's skill requires that he is the one dealing damage to enemies, but I've actually made it so that if he's off-field, allies can trigger the coordinated attack. This actually puts Yanqing in a really cool position where he's the first off-field physical DPS. It also creates a unique choose-your-own playstyle similar to Fremine. Instead of it being cryo versus physical, it's on-field versus off-field. Speaking of playstyles, let's cover that part next. There are two main playstyles, a high-risk high-reward on-fielder or a low-risk low-reward off-fielder. If you choose to play on-field as Yanqing, you're dealing more damage with his coordinated attacks and basic attacks, but you need to rely on a shielder or really good iframing to prevent taking damage and disabling your soul steal. In Yanqing's off-field playstyle, he doesn't have to worry about taking damage, but in return for safety, the chance to trigger the attack is basically halved. This does mean Yanqing's personal damage is lower, but it could be compensated by having another on-fielder to be the main DPS. As another note, Snow Shards are not going to deal heavy hits. This means that they won't shatter a frozen enemy, which means that even as a physical unit, Yanqing is viable to use in a freeze-related comp. More on that in the team comp section. For his particle generation, he can create one cryo particle once every 3 seconds through his Snow Shard, regardless of his field stance. This allows him to be either a good battery for himself or his teammates. Next is converting his ultimate into an elemental burst. Everything about Yanqing's burst is basically the same. At level 8, Yanqing gains the Luofu Cloud effect, increasing his crit rate by 60%. If he has a Soul Steal effect, crit damage is also increased by 45%. Luofu Cloud lasts for 12 seconds. He will also unleash a string of attacks using his swords, dealing crowd damage equal to 315% of his attack. It'll have an 80 cost burst and a 20-second cooldown. Simple concept. Cast its burst, deal damage, gain crit bonuses. Overall, I would argue that in this format, Yanqing's burst is a really good buff to his damage, but unlike the other units, he isn't burst reliant. It's the same vein as Nahida's burst. Ideally, you want it up as much as possible for the various buffs and EM bonus, but she does just fine with just her skill. In short, ER and a cryo battery are recommended but not required. Yanqing's A1 passive takes inspiration from his A2 trace. There it says Yanqing deals additional ice damage equal to 30% of his attack to enemies with ice weakness. Obviously, in Genshin, ice weakness isn't really a thing, so I changed it to this. While Soul Steal is active, Yanqing's basic attacks will deal an additional instance of cryo damage equal to 30% of his attack. This damage is considered as basic attack damage. This kind of attack is just like Fremine's skill, where he still deals physical auto attacks, but there's a separate hit of cryo. This is a decent increase to his damage, but the main goal is to give him a way to apply cryo for reactions such as superconduct or freeze. That way, he's not reliant on another cryo unit, which should make team building slightly more flexible. Yanqing's A4 is inspired from his A6 trace. For 4 seconds after Yanqing lands a crit hit, his attack speed is increased by 10%. When Yanqing's on field, practically every single basic attack is going to trigger Snow Shard. By increasing his attack speed, he hits faster, triggers more Snow Shards, and deals more overall damage. This of course further incentivizes using him as an on-fielder. After all, if he's off-field, this buff is pointless. And finally, his exploration talent. Surprisingly, we don't have a unit that refunds a portion of forging materials when you create a sword, similarly to the passives of Ganyu, Diluc, or Zhongli. So that's what Yanqing will do. Yanqing will refund 15% of the ore used when crafting sword-type weapons. Simple, practical, and true to his character. Usually in this kind of format I'd look at Constellations next, but for this series I want to discuss his build options first. So let's look at his artifact builds. Yanqing's best main sets are going to be attack, physical damage, and crit. I would not recommend using ER on him, and this should only be looked for in substats along with attack and crit. He's going to have two best artifact sets. For his on-field playstyle, Pale Flame is going to provide the most damage since its skill hits will easily stack the passive. It'll also be a very good increase in damage for its auto attacks. Being an attack scaling physical DPS, all of the bonuses will be useful on him. For an off-field DPS, Golden Tree will be his best option. Since Pale Flame doesn't stack off-field, this set is much more reliable. Additionally, Yanqing's main output will be through his skill, making this set shine a bit more. For other alternatives, Blizzard Strayer can work since Yanqing's cryo attacks can freeze the enemy, but you have to remember he's built with a lot of crit bonuses, which may cause the 40% crit rate to overcap. Of course, two-piece combos can work well, with the best being a Pale Flame Bloodstain combo for general physical damage output. Next up, I'll just cover his best weapons. For free-to-play options, he has a very large amount, so I won't list every single one. Some of the more notable pieces are Cool Steel for his cryo-related damage bonus, Harbinger of Dawn since using Yanqing with the shielder should keep him above 90% HP, Amenoma, but only if you want to use his burst every rotation, and Prototype Rancor for its physical damage and attack bonus. It also comes with some defense bonuses, which could help him and his shield take a bit more damage. You can also consider using Festering Desire for its skill damage and crit bonuses. Oh, what was that? You weren't here in 1.2? Oof, that must suck for you. For premium 4-star options, Wolffang is going to provide a decent crit bonus to Yanqing's skill and burst, but this would only be useful for an on-field playstyle since you can't gain stacks off-field. Alley Flash has a pretty high base attack and a passive that relies on the user not taking damage. Since Yanqing already has this kind of mechanic implemented in its kit, this shouldn't feel too out of place. Only main downside is the EM subset, which doesn't provide anything to his physical playstyle. For 5-star options, any of the crit weapons would work well as stat sticks, but the passives don't perfectly synergize with him. For example, Mistsplitter only buffs elemental damage and Lo-Fi skills with EM. Splendor of Tranquil Waters makes him reliant on Farina and a healer in addition to a shielder, but at least the HP drain wouldn't count as taking damage. Uraku Misagiri also works, but he requires a Geo unit to buff his damage, likely making Zhongli the optimal unit since he can give a shield. Some of the better options include Aquila Favonia for its physical damage and attack bonus. It also deals a shockwave of damage to nearby enemies which does scale on physical damage and crit. Additionally, it has a healing effect. Ideally, you don't want him to get hurt at all, but if Yanqing does take damage, he can at least remain self-sustaining, which would open up options for another DPS or support unit. Summit Shaper is also a great option. You might start getting diminishing returns since there's a lot of attack stats, but since he's reliant on shielders, he'll make great use of the passive. Once again, these two options are his best general weapons that should work for his overall team comms, but the other options can be useful. And of course, we can't forget the segment I love to talk about, the signature weapon. Looking at his 5-star light cone Sleep Like the Dead, it has a pretty high base attack and a bunch of crit bonuses. He has an unconditional crit damage bonus, so I chose to make that the substat. His passive would then become that every time a crit hit is not dealt, you gain a 36% crit rate bonus. In an attempt to balance out the weapon, I'm making it so that it will specifically buff skill crit rate, since a 36% general crit rate buff is really powerful. I also decided to take some bonuses from his 4-star light cone, River Flows in Spring. So it would grant him an attack speed bonus, which is good for triggering his follow-ups consistently. And he'll also gain a damage bonus, which I'll convert to physical damage. Okay, let's wrap it all up. I've named it One Shoe Sword, which is taken from his technique. It will have a 674 base attack with a 44.1% crit damage bonus. For its passive, the user gains a 12% attack speed bonus and a 24 to 60% physical damage bonus. If the user takes damage, these bonuses will end for 5 seconds. Additionally, if the user doesn't deal a crit hit, increase skill crit rate by 36 to 54% for 6 seconds, and this can trigger once every 12 seconds. This bonus can trigger while off-field. If you don't know my whole allocating rule, it basically means that if I reduce a bonus for one, I increase it for another. Since at R5 the sword would grant a 72% crit rate bonus, I felt that was way too strong. So I decreased the crit rate bonus and brought some more power into the physical damage bonus for R5. But for the sake of judging the weapon, we'd be looking at R1 anyway. There are two categories for alternate users: on-fielders who use the attack speed bonus, and off-field skill damage dealers. For Ayaka and Ayato, this weapon is still around 17 to 90% worse since they can't synergize as well with the physical damage bonus or the skill damage crit rate. Just to remind everyone, Ayato's skill stance is considered normal attack damage. Then for Farina and Shiori, it's around 23 to 25% worse since they don't benefit as well from the higher base attack, as well as the crit damage subset being basically half of what their signatures provide. The reason I decided to do the build section before Constellations is so I could establish a common scenario for calculations. Let's start off by comparing artifact main stats. For this, we're going to be focusing on his skill damage with Yanqing on a 4-piece Pale Flame set and his theoretical signature weapon. And finally, assuming Superconduct has occurred for its 40% physical resistance debuff. I have 3 categories for main stats: attack damage crit damage, attack damage attack, and attack attack crit damage. For this first set of comparisons, we are assuming Yanqing doesn't have its burst crit bonuses. Surprisingly, the numbers are extremely close to one another, but attack damage attack pulls ahead by 1.7%, which is minimal at best. If Yanqing is able to gain both of his burst crit bonuses, then his attack damage attack stats only pull ahead by around 0.2%, which is an even smaller gap. Next, I wanted to look at the exact same comparisons but for an off-field playstyle on Golden Troop. Without Yanqing's burst, attack damage attack is a better choice at a 3.7 increase in damage, but with Yanqing's burst, attack damage attack is only better with a 2.2% increase. Overall, the difference between these main stat combos is very minimal, making it heavily based on substats, weapon choices, team comps, and external buffs. I've already established that an on-field playstyle does more damage, but the question for this part is, how much? For the next section, we'll see how much more damage an on-field Pale Flame set works compared to an off-field Golden Troop set. I'll stick with an attack damage crit damage combo for main stats, and we'll just assume no burst bonuses. We're looking at a 43% decrease in damage when using an off-field playstyle. The main takeaway is that you want another DPS unit to offset this loss. Next up is an artifact comparison on both playstyles. First up is the on-field playstyle compared to Pale Flame. The other sets are going to be a 2-piece combo with both physical damage 2-piece sets, and Blizzard Strayer's 40% crit rate. Pale Flame is still going to be the best option in damage. While Blizzard Strayer does look very competitive, we have to remember that this is without substats. With Blizzard Strayer, Yanqing would get a total of 99.8% crit rate, and this is without the burst bonuses. This effectively makes all additional crit rate buffs and subsets meaningless due to the hard limit. So while it's possible to use Blizzard Strayer for Yanqing Freeze, it is highly unrecommended. Let's take a look at a simple 15% crit rate bonus to demonstrate. While the other two sets get a decent buff in average damage, the output on Blizzard Strayer barely changes, making it fall behind. Finally, we can compare Yanqing's signature with other weapons. I looked at comparing it to Aquila Favonia, Summit Shaper, and Wolfang since those have the best synergy. One of the factors with Yanqing's signature is actually the attack speed bonus, since it would increase his Snow Shard triggers. At base, he gets a 10% attack speed bonus through his A4, and with his signature he gets another 12%. Since hit lag and frame calculations are a very finicky process, I decided to do a streamlined formula that would calculate average attack speed bonuses. So take the attack speed sections with a grain of salt. Without his burst crit buffs, Wolfang is actually the most competitive option, being only around 3% weaker. With his burst bonuses, however, the crit rate bonuses from Wolfang and his signature overcap, making the extra crit worthless and putting Wolf at a much lower ranking. Meanwhile, Summit and Aquila become much better, but unfortunately still worse than his signature by around 12 to 17%. Assuming Yanqing and his weapon were to make it into the game as it is, the power gap between free-to-play and paid players would be pretty noticeable. But at least his signature is a best-in-slot option. Other characters I cover later on may not have that luxury. There are a lot of combinations I haven't covered in this calculation section, but hopefully this gives you a general idea of his build comparisons. Now that we've looked at his kit, build, and damage calculations, we can look at his constellations. When I show you damage calculations, it'll just assume an ADC build with its signature and Pale Flame. Yanqing's E1 states that when he attacks a frozen enemy, he deals additional ice damage equal to 60% of his attack. Since freezing an enemy is something he can inherently do, I didn't want to implement that into a C1 since that basically forces a freeze comb. So instead, I changed it so that Yanqing's Snow Shard damage deals an additional 60% of his attack. This is objectively going to be his best constellation since it increases the damage multiplier by nearly 170% of its original value. Here is a difference between C0 and C1 Yanqing. True to what I said, his skill output is roughly a 68% increase in damage. It's also one of his best constellations because it's an early one. Being a standard unit, it's highly likely that players will be able to obtain this constellation. At C2, when So Steel is active, Yanqing's energy recharge is increased by 10%. This constellation has a very low ER value, but assuming you can keep the effect active, it does have 100% uptime. So I guess it kind of balances out here and there. It does help with Yanqing's energy needs, but it's only necessary when you're trying to burst on rotation. At C3, Elemental skill level is increased by 3. This constellation increases his skill cast damage, his coordinated attack damage, and the crit buffs, making it one of his better constellations. Compared to C0, we're looking at a 94% increase in damage, nearly double from what he originally does. At C4, if Yanqing's current HP is above 80%, his attacks will apply a 12% cryo and physical resistance shred to opponents for 3 seconds. Physical resistance shred is already extremely high in his superconduct teams, so while it works in HSR, it isn't as needed in Genshin. Still, a res shred is a damage boost, so it will still help his output. Compared to C0, this exceeds double of its original damage, around 104% higher. At C5, elemental burst level is increased by 3. This increases Yanqing's cryo-based burst damage and his crit damage bonus. His crit rate is hard capped at 60% at every level, so this doesn't change. The damage gap changes a bit when you take into account the crit bonuses. Between C0 and C4 with the burst state, the gap is around 101% higher instead of 104. Between C0 and C5 with the burst, the gap is only around 105, meaning that the difference between C4 and C5 is extremely small for his skill damage output. But for his personal burst damage, the gap is a bit higher, being around 20% better. Yanqing's original C6 states that when he defeats an enemy while the skill or ultimates buffs are active, those respective buffs get extended for 1 turn. This is a very underwhelming constellation, especially at C6. I didn't stray too far from the power level, so the idea I had might still be underwhelming, but I'm essentially going to keep the extension buff plus a little something extra. If an ally defeats an enemy while Yanqing's skill or burst buffs are active, those respective buffs get extended by an additional 6 seconds. Additionally, as long as Yanqing stays above 50% HP, taking damage will not remove the soul seal effect. This constellation is less of a damage buff and more of a quality of life buff. In addition to extending his ability's duration, there's more flexibility for team comp options. Instead of bringing a shielder, Yanqing can instead slot in a healer who's guaranteed to keep him above half health. This can be especially good against enemies who deal more chip damage instead of massive burst hits. Finally, we can discuss Yanqing's potential team comps. Let's start off with teammates who can synergize best with his general teams. Before C6, shielders are basically a must if you want to play him on field. The best option is going to be Zhongli because of his shield's high HP, as well as its physical and elemental shred. Diona and Layla can also be great shielders while providing the cryo resonance and particle generation. Mika can also be a great option due to its physical damage and attack speed bonuses. He also produces a lot of particles which can help battery Yanqing. In the case where Yanqing is C6, Mika can utilize his healing a lot more, keeping Yanqing above 50% HP if no shielder is present. For specific team archetypes, the first is a superconduct team. This includes Yanqing as a physical DPS, an electro unit like Fissile for extra damage or Riding for extra energy, a shielder, and a flex slot. You can also look into a combination of superconduct and freeze. This includes Yanqing, a hydro unit for freeze, an electro unit for superconduct, and a flex slot. Permafreeze is also an option since keeping an enemy frozen at all times can remove the need for a shielder, since the enemies wouldn't be able to attack you as much anyway. Finally, you can do an on-field Hyperfridge comp, which is a team of Yanqing, Hydro, Electro, and Dendro. The main problem is that shielding utility is going to be a lot harder to come by in this comp, meaning that you'll struggle with using Yanqing in an on-field role, so I personally don't recommend this one. But this is a good segue to discuss his viability as an off-fielder. The interesting thing with an off-field physical DPS is that their attacks wouldn't disrupt reactions. This means that nearly any team can slot in Yanqing to deal extra damage on the side. The best teams for an off-field playstyle are still going to be the ones I mentioned earlier, since they have some kind of cryo-based synergy involved. With that being said, Yanqing doesn't have any form of cryo application while off-field, so you'd be reliant on another party member to apply cryo for freeze or superconduct. In a physical-based team, you can pair Yanqing up with someone like Razor, Fremine, or Eula, and then bring some electro and flex units to help buff the overall damage. Since Yanqing would be off-field, he wouldn't take damage, and this means a shielder is not as necessary, if at all. Alright, that's gonna do it for the first episode of Trailblazer 2 Traveler. Let me know in the comments which aspect of the redesign you liked, what you would change, or any alternate ideas you have. Also, let me know what character you want me to cover next in this series. If you enjoyed, consider leaving a like and subscribing to support the channel. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!